to the Mortal Realms, an Age of Sigmar story phase. Grab your hammer so we can clear a path through the chaos and forge our own narrative in the Age of Sigmar. Your allies to the Stargates this episode are...
Well, my name is Paul, and what do you call it when Seraphon bring a ziggurat down and land it in the realms?
What?
Jurassic Parking.
I'm Aaron. Put your headdress on, leave the Amazon, everybody walk the Seraphon.
Wow. Impressive. And I'm Phil, here from my own spawning pool, just for this episode.
Nice.
And this is Eric. Get the sheriff, son. We're hunting Seraphon. In this episode, we cover the lore of the Seraphon Battletome. Get ready to hear a whole lot of unintelligible growling, unfathomable plans, and head into the stars. And then, if we have time after that, we'll talk about those lizardmen. How are you doing tonight, my Spawnstellation brothers?
So good.
Whoa.
Oh, God, listeners, at this point in the episode, you do not know how difficult that intro was for all of us.
Yeah.
Well, they wouldn't have known. I mean, I pulled that off slick in the edit.
Nobody
Yeah.
said it was you, all right? We were just nice.
I said
and
us.
said
I wasn't
it was
pointing
just
any
a
fingers.
problem.
I gotta find a new scripting coach, new copywriter for this.
A lot of this is going to make it in the back end of the episode, though. I promise you that.
Oh, boy.
Are you guys doing all right in stuck here in the void? You guys handling the isolation all right?
Yes.
I feel like I'm on a spaceship in the space between realms, isolated from the world at large, but I'll survive. If the Seraphon can do it, I can do it.
For sure. You just need a magical god dragon to come and save you at the end. That's all.
Yeah.
Actually, I have like 3 or 4 of those, I think, here somewhere. So
Oh, okay.
Sweet.
You're good. Solid. You should share those.
on
Let me
the
send
shelf.
you my address.
I'm just sitting in my own gibbering dome, having a great time. So I gotta
Awesome.
say.
Nice.
I mean, also good, but sad about
Yeah.
Akon.
Yeah. Way to
Nobody
bring
said I
everybody
wasn't
down.
crazy.
Jeez.
Eric, how are you doing? How are you surviving? If you are, in fact.
I am surviving. I'm here, and I'm feeling good. And I'm ready to hang out with you guys. So I'm
Nice.
excited.
Have you gotten any hobby done since the last episode?
Gotten a little bit of hobby done. I've got a couple of things here by my desk. So if there's like 5 minutes where I can't, shoot off an email or whatever, I might pick up a brush and paint a check on one of my checker pattern planes. So yeah, it's all
How
good.
about you? How about you, Paul? What kind of hobby have you been doing?
Well, I built an army. I built a Squigalanche inspired by Ben Johnson. Did some conversions on it that I'm pretty happy with. I built a ton of terrain and started painting it as well. So, actually got quite a bit done.
Very cool. Did you have many squigs before? You're a goblin guy.
Yes, I have the old metal squigs, but all the plastic squigs were all built in the last 2 weeks.
Oh, geez, Louise.
So that was a fun
congrats.
project. So
Right on. Phil, have you been doing any hobbying?
I have been very busy with work, and I have been spending a lot of time with my wife. So I have not done any hobbying, and I am very much looking forward to doing this recording so that I can feel sort of like I'm still part of this hobby.
Yeah. Tapped in. Or convince your wife to hobby with you, because a couple that hobbies together stays together.
Very true.
Fact.
I have nothing to base that on. I wouldn't even know what that looked like, but fair enough.
People have told me that this must be true.
I read it. I read it somewhere in a book.
On the internet.
in
Yeah.
a book.
On an internet book. To make this short and sweet, have not hobbied on anything whatsoever, because as listeners know, for the most part, all I ever do is file stuff, and it's hard to have a really sharp knife in your hand when your kids are around, just all the time. So, no, I screeching halt, standstill. But yeah, like you folks have said, I feel like this is going to be my outlet tonight, right now, will be my interfacing with the hobby world at large. You fine gentlemen.
Awesome. You've reached the peak.
Yeah, we've
The pinnacle.
it's only downhill from here. But
Oh,
But no, I mean, guys, it's looking up. Daylight savings is here. Like, it's getting brighter and lighter and warmer. No, I'm optimistic. I think
It was over 50 degrees today, getting outside.
Yeah.
I personally didn't leave the house, but it looked nice out my window.
Yeah.
But hey, enough about real life nonsense. Just bringing everybody down. Let's get transported to a dream world of magic, and we can talk about our story phase today. And we are going to be chatting about, as Eric mentioned earlier, the Seraphon Battletome came out not too long ago. How exciting! You guys jazzed?
So
Super
excited.
jazzed.
Super duper excited.
Well, in that case, let's jump right into the story phase. Paul, if you would.
Yeah. In the story phase, we delve into the stories, characters, creatures, and environments of the 9 realms, and even the space above them.
Ooh, yes, the high altitudes. All right, cool. So we're gonna do a story phase. We're doing a battle tome. So I personally like to start, and since I'm talking, I'm going to start here. We're going to talk about who the race is generally, and what better way to do so is I want to get your guys's 1-sentence description of who the Seraphon are. For those folks who don't know them, who aren't familiar with the old lizardmen of the previous game, or the Seraphon as they exist today, how would you use 1 sentence to catch someone up? I'm going to start with Paul because he always has a good one.
All right. They are alien, Aztec, lizardmen, spaceship-dwelling, primeval monsters.
Okay.
I don't know if that's a sentence, though.
Well, he said they are, so it could have been anything. Yeah.
Okay.
I was about to pick it apart, but sure. Eric, let's see if you can do one better.
Nope, I can't.
Oh.
I encourage you to try.
All right. The Seraphon are a race of star lizards, laser dinosaur, thunder monsters. Crap, I couldn't do a sentence either. It's just a bunch of cool things jammed together, man.
It's true, as most Age of Sigmar armies are. Phil, can you? I mean, these guys have done this before. Can you teach
Save
the
us.
teachers, master the masters? Can you give me your rendition, a 1-sentence description of these Seraphon?
I can certainly
Please
try.
save me.
So the Seraphon are dinosaur-riding lizards led by frogs in space.
In space.
In space.
Oh goodness. I guess I'm going to try too. I was hoping. I mean, Phil's was a very good one. I was hoping it would just be a showstopper, so I wouldn't even have to attempt it. But I'm going to try and slide in here. I'm going to say simultaneously primitive and yet impossibly advanced. The Seraphon are lizard humanoids empowered by the realm of Azir with the mission to clear chaos from the mortal realms. What do you guys think about that?
It's good. It's good.
I feel I should just quit English.
I got a round of applause, and then Phil slides in there with the it's fine. I guess it's cool.
We'll get
you guys
to
are giving me
we'll get to the details.
Yeah, mixed messages. All right, so let's talk. Let's try to find some similarities. What was some of the through lines from our sentence descriptions besides just flat out lizards? Which anybody looking at the book or at the models can see that these are a lizard people. Let's think. So I think I heard that there was a lot of space references. What about space or stars? What does that have to do with the Seraphon here? Does anybody have any thoughts on that?
Ooh, I got this.
Hit me.
So, well, the space, by space we mean the upper echelon, the outer realms or rim of Azir. And they've come not only to Azirs where they've kind of landed in mass, but through the void. They are found floating through the void, which is the space between realms and beyond realms. And they came from the old world, escaped in their starships as the old world was being destroyed. And so kind of they found over thousands and thousands of years were drifting and their ships powered down. So the space is this, the void and, Azir kind of make up this space that they're from. Space.
Yeah. Well, and you talk about Azir, and that's another component. It's not just, they're just outer space alien type folks, but they are sort of tethered, I guess, to the mortal realms in some sense, in that they are sort of imbued by Azirian magic, or the realm of Azir, kind of similarly to like the way the Stormcast are. So the lightning is sort of in their veins, or at least the light is in their veins as well. So they are sort of directly tied to Azir, and that sort of informs a lot of who they are and why they are, and their role in the realms as well. So that's fairly important. Phil, you had mentioned frogs. Expand on that, if you would.
Sure. So the frogs that I was referencing are the creatures known as the Slann, who are these all, I guess, not entirely all-knowing, but extremely prescient amphibious mages that lead the Seraphon through their goals of trying to destroy chaos. And they are always thinking in these long, grand schemes, and are extremely powerful in terms of magic, but don't busy themselves with day-to-day tasks very often.
And they're very like abstract. Like it would blow your mind if you had any concept of what was going on in their froggy brains.
For sure.
Paul, Phil had sort of mentioned, fighting chaos. Like the Seraphon do have a mission or a goal. Like, would you be willing to talk about that at all?
Well, they have this grand plan, which was given to them by the Old Ones. This is something that was referenced very heavily in the Warhammer Fantasy Battle lore, and is making a comeback now in the AOS lore. So for the Mortal Realms, the Slann believe that the Old Ones actually created the Mortal Realms, and the Mortal Realms contains the same sort of ley lines and magic that the Old World did. And their grand plan is to organize, dominate, defend these nexuses of power that are created by the ley lines in order to fulfill the Old One's plans. And the Old One's plans were created in order to destroy chaos. It failed in the Old World, so they're going to try again in the Mortal Realms to eliminate chaos from the realms. That was a cool, interesting little development.
Sure. They're sort of the consummate, like, anti-chaos. Like, that is, I mean, if maybe other people sort of are like, chaos is gross, so I don't like them. But, like, Seraphon are locked in, like, focused to the end of chaos. My
limited impression of them from 8th edition, I felt like their mission was survive the Skaven. A lot of the stories I got were just they were in doom and peril by the Skaven as a mortal enemy. So this definitely kind of puts them where Skaven have been maybe put as the lowest of the low in Age of Sigmar. This kind of elevates them to kind of the highest of the high, interestingly enough.
They were always trying to destroy chaos. Like, that was the ultimate goal, is to end the chaos gods. But the Skaven were always a problem, because they were always, like, getting into their temple cities and stuff.
They're always getting in there. And so I guess maybe one difference is, well, and I'm not know if now's the time to talk about it, but like old lizardmen were kind of isolationist, just because they were just happened to be separated by an ocean from everybody. And that maybe is similar in some ways to what the Seraphon are now, because they are sort of removed from the realms at large, and we're sort of removed from society. Whereas I think now they're taking a little bit more of an active role in sort of the eradication of chaos, which they maybe weren't as uniquely positioned to do so in the Old World.
Yeah. But I think one of the interesting things about this specific background is that it says that the Old World was surrounded by the Void, and the Mortal Realms is surrounded by the Void. So there is some connection between the two of them, right? Even though the old world is blown up, they're accessible through the void. What we don't have an idea of is the distance traveled between the old world and the mortal realms. But we know that there was some distance that was traveled. And we do know that the spaceships of the Slann are ziggurats, and they are powered by magic. And that within the void, the magic has been removed enough to the point where they were forced to go into basically hibernation in order to not die, and were eventually awoken by Dracothian.
I guess just to hit on a point that you had mentioned, because I feel like I've read this, but I don't know for certain. But didn't Sigmar survive the end times by like holding on to the husk of the old world after it had exploded, and that's how Dracothian found him and brought him to the mortal realms? So we know at least two things from the old world crossed the void.
Mm-hmm.
Well, at this point, a bunch of stuff from the old world now have survived for any number of reasons. But
yeah. a bunch of it. So Nagash obviously survived, but these are the first things that are not gods that survived intact from the destruction of the end times into the mortal realms, without the aid of a god, right? Like some of the characters might have survived from the old world, but they survived within the belly of Slaanesh or some such thing, right? These, of their own agency, fled the old world before the destruction and arrived in the mortal realms intact. And the interesting thing is that these Slann, to our knowledge, have not been changed, right? These are the same Slann, to the point where even the only named character in the book is a Slann, who is the same Slann that he was in the old world. So most of the characters that we experience on the tabletop are actually reincarnations or changed from mortal into immortal gods. But these are the first mortal beings that arrived from, they basically stepped from one world to the next, unchanged as it were, which is a fascinating hook to me.
Well, I would maybe disagree with that. And let me explain why as the story progresses. So Dracothian finds them basically, and they're as they're sort of floating in space, they drop into this like suspended animation a little bit. Like the Slann realize that they're losing their followers through this like endless like traveling that they're doing, and so they start powering down the ships a little bit, going into a stasis. Putting their lizards to sleep, basically. Well, as you know, things get cold and their body temperature drops and they, hibernate.
You might say they're cold-blooded.
What? I mean, yeah, I would explicitly say that. Anyways, Dracothian finds them and he sort of imbues his magic and he leads them to the mortal realms and Azir specifically. So their spaceships are like, oh, sweet, let's follow this guy. And they boogie to Azir and they set up shop in sort of the high reaches, like the high echelons, up into the higher strata of Azir in their spaceships, and they're able to absorb some of this Azirian energy. And in doing so, they're able to bring their sleeping forces back to life. And because they exist in this realm for so long and it's in such a like unique space, they actually themselves become imbued with Azirian energy, and it starts to like permeate them and I guess run through their veins. So in a sense, maybe they're not cold-blooded. They're not blooded at all, but oftentimes they have Azirian magic through their veins as well. And when you say that they're not changed, I would say maybe they are changed because that was never necessarily a component of the lizardmen before. I mean, granted, they had access to the lower heavens. So, I mean, they had some connection to that, but they were never, chock full of it. Like it wasn't coursing through them. And so I would say that maybe that would be a distinct difference. Now, granted, I don't know if that's just like through the Sauruses and the Skinks and maybe the Slann, I should say, aren't necessarily as different, but I mean, they could be too. Like they might be just as tied to Azir as the rest of their forces are. But that's where they...
Yeah. Can I capitulate but clarify? Can I say that they haven't changed, but the mortal realms has changed them? Is that a fair point?
That doesn't...
Distinction without a difference.
Yeah, not at all.
I do think that I think you're right that the Slann probably haven't changed at all, because my understanding was that the reason that they now are imbued with the magic of Azir is because their ships are being powered by the magic of Azir, and so the spawning pools are being powered by the magic of Azir. And so as they started spawning new Saurus and Skinks, they were inherently imbued with the magic of Azir.
Okay. Yeah,
but the
okay.
Slann are effectively immortal, and so they haven't been respawned. They can't spawn more Slann, in fact. So they are the same, but all of the creatures they continue to spawn to replenish their armies are new.
Okay, fair enough.
And we can touch on more of that when they start to coalesce, because they start to change.
Man,
So-
cool buzzword.
Do you want to hear a hot take?
Not yet.
I guess so.
All right. Sigmar stole the Sigmarabulum idea from the Seraphon. What?
Sigmar.
If the Seraphon had already
Yes.
been leaving in the High Azir.
Did Sigmar know about the Seraphon?
I would imagine he had to.
I think he did. Well, let's jump into, like, I guess what happens next, because it's while they're setting up shop up in the High Azir, the Mortal Realms are existing at this point, and the Seraphon start dropping in here and there periodically, and spending a little bit more time in the Mortal Realms. However, they're not necessarily dramatically interacting with the burgeoning civilizations of the Mortal Realms in this Age of Myth. There's these sort of primitive societies that are growing. Sigmar's doing what he's doing, and I guess the rest of the Pantheon are doing what they can to sort of foster the Mortal Realms and generate sort of the life that we know sort of today. And the Seraphon, like there's what would you call it? They have sort of legends and myths about the Seraphon. Like the people are writing like hieroglyphs on cave walls and stuff about like these mythical beasts, but they're not integrating really with the world. But what are they doing? Does anybody have any thoughts on how the Seraphon are spending the Age of Myth?
Well, so they're doing a few things, but one that I thought was particularly interesting. So there's a bit in here in the Age of Myth where, as you mentioned, Sigmar is sort of doing his thing, uplifting tribes from the realms. But in that time, it mentions that the Slann were choosing certain tribes to grant them additional like magic or technology to raise up specific groups in the mortal realms, ostensibly because that is part of their greater plan. As they are trying to sort of lay the foundations for the future battles against chaos. Which I think is really interesting, that it's sort of saying that the Seraphon in some ways decided like the trajectory of the early, at least somewhat, the trajectory of the early ages of the realms, which obviously is a big change in the history here a little bit.
Yeah. Well, we talk about how, like, as time goes forward, like it's in real life, as we get more books and we learn more about the Mortal Realms at large, and the timeline sort of moves forward. When these new Battletomes come out, we have opportunities to look backwards in the past and sort of pepper what we thought we knew already, and sort of interject in fun, clever ways how some of these armies could have been important back then. And this is another example of, all right, well, we thought we knew kind of how civilizations grew and were sort of cemented in the Mortal Realms back in the Age of Myth. But here's another take or another perspective, or here's something we didn't know about before, but is very plausible and makes a lot of sense. And this is another example of that, which is always fun to see. I think, Paul, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is that what this actually allows is, because the Slann are the people who are making these decisions about what's going forward, and the Slann were in the old world, it gives some credence to the idea that the civilizations that arose in the mortal realms would bear a striking resemblance to the civilizations that existed in the old world, right? And this is an interesting theme that I think is going to bear fruit later on in time, is that the lizardmen are this stable continuum, in my mind at least, of what is happening. They were fighting chaos in the old world. They're fighting chaos in the mortal realms now. And they are this stable point of reference that it's interesting to me how they can watch what was an elf in the old world and what's an elf in the new world and decide whether or not that elf is changed, whether it's for chaos or against chaos, right? And because of those little interesting decisions, I think it adds credence to keeping most of those model lines from the old world, at least in a narrative sense.
Okay, sure. I like one of the parallels of having the Seraphon go back in time, or not just back in the Age of Myth, and like sort of imparting technologies to like these primitive people and sort of selecting who succeeds and stuff. It's kind of like the conspiracy theories that people think that the pyramids were built like by aliens.
That's true. That's true.
Same kind of deal, which is one Seraphon like ziggurats, which are kind of like pyramids. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
Put two together. And also in that little story, Phil, that you'd mentioned, it's cool that it goes on to say that like some of those societies that they start to like foster, like those the descendants of those societies are some of the first like Stormcast as well. So it's almost you gotta wonder like did they know that was going to be a thing eventually? Because they could have, which is kind of cool.
For one of the other cool stories is the binding the Astro Matrix. So this is the ley lines that I was talking about a little bit earlier. There still are these native veins of magic that exist within the mortal realms, and there are these nexuses of magic where the ley lines cross that are especially potent, and the Seraphons start to take over and command these ley lines, right? And start to unleash their grand plan, as it were. So there was a cool re-upping of the old lore, but at the same time clarifying a lot of how the mortal realms works, I think, which is really interesting to me. Just the idea of ley lines and conquering and nexuses is just a super cool concept in my mind.
So, and I think an interesting thing to sort of interject here is that they mention in here that realm gates were created by the old ones, which is this really weird thing of like, okay, so the old ones existed in both places somehow, but either way, it's suggested that these ley lines in the realms are sort of the channels through which the realm gates work, which is partially why the Seraphon find them to be so important, because they have miniaturized versions of realm gates inside their ships, which is how they can teleport their troops all around the realms. And so I just think it's interesting that, again, we were able to look back and say, okay, here's these things that have existed since the beginning of the Age of Sigmar in the game, and that it's like, okay, you can teleport between realms, and that's how people travel, but like giving it this sort of rooting in some sort of history that we didn't have previously.
We'll talk about more like the old ones probably a little bit later, but I want to point out that I don't know that it ever definitively says the old ones made the realm gates. It seems to have been left open-ended, and we can talk more about that later.
Are you saying there's an unreliable narrator, Aaron? Is that what I'm hearing?
Quite possibly.
Yeah,
I hear someone flipping through the book. We'll talk about it.
Yeah, a cool nod back to the old world, though, because the gate at the pole of the top of the old world was built by the old ones, and it was a realm gate of some sort that was supposed to siphon off the excess magic that ended up allowing chaos into the old world. So it's not a 180 turn from the old. It's not a 180 degree flip from the old lore, and I think it ties in nicely with the way that the Mortal Realms works. So that was a super cool touch that I really appreciated.
I wanted to come back real quick because I think as we get into talking about gods from the stars, their ability to move around, binding the Astro Matrix, being able to control realm gates, even change where their destination is, so they can change if a realm gate is typically static between Akshi and Garan, they can use that same realm gate to go someplace else. And I think this is where I feel like, and I don't have infinite knowledge of the old world lore, but in general, the public knowledge of the Seraphon is that they were a static, stuck in the South American counts as jungle. And I can appreciate that they always had a hate for chaos, but they had very little they could do. Chaos was north. they're all the way south. There was never much implicit or explicit story of them clashing with chaos. In the Age of Sigmar, they're not stuck anywhere. They are everywhere, and they're where they want to be, and they are coming after chaos with a focus, which is not anything that was really emphasized in the most obvious points of their representation in 8th edition. So I think this is to me, from a point of view of just, looking at them from the surface, there's no question that these guys are out for chaos blood. They can go anywhere.
It's almost like they're making up for lost time, or like they're making up for maybe a shortcoming from the old world. They're like, all right, well, we sat back and let the world crumble, so like we're not going to make that same mistake again, which is super cool.
Well, I mean, so this is probably not the perfect place to put this, but at the old Healing Hammer podcast, there was always this joke about how did the lizardmen get to Bretonnia, right? How did the Skaven get to Cathay, where they had all these battles in the old world? And Dan Heelan always used to say, oh, there was a portal. Oh, there was a portal, right? And in the Mortal Realms, there literally is a portal. It's called a Realm Gate. And it's hilarious to me that this is actually a great explanation for how everything works. And it is now hardwired into the Mortal Realms for why one race can get to where another race is all the time and for any reason.
Yeah, it's weird that like the realms are now bigger than they ever were, or bigger than the old world ever was, and yet it's even easier to get to wherever you want to be.
And yet no place is safe.
Yeah,
I will say, I wish they had credited the Seraphon for creating the realm gates, as opposed to like a mysterious old race.
That's an interesting point. I would disagree personally, but that's a fair point to make for sure.
Some mortal scholars believe that the Slann were even partially responsible for the construction of the first realm gates. Anyways,
there we go.
So that's basically the Age of Myth summed up. The Seraphon doing mysterious stuff, helping when they need to help, looking for or what would you call it? Fixating on this Astra Matrix. But we all know how history went, and that the Age of Chaos was coming. And it turns out I think the Seraphon probably knew at some point too. And when Chaos finally reached sort of their strongest point, and the Age of Chaos started spilling over the mortal realms, all hell basically was breaking loose. What the Seraphon did at this time was fairly interesting. It's actually kind of related to Phil's story from before, is that a conclave of Slann Star Masters all got together and decided that they were going to guide their forces and sort of drop them in like strategic places around places of really like immense power, in order to sort of distract chaos and draw chaos and sort of separate them and put them where they wanted them in the mortal realms, with the express goal of allowing the civilizations or the citizens of these realms to boogie to the nearest realm gate to Azir and escape in time. And for the most part, no one knew that they were doing this, or no one can sort of credit their safety to the actions taken by the Seraphon, but they did it. And because of that, who knows how many lives were saved because of the actions that they took and the distractions that they were causing in the mortal realms. So how cool is that? To think that like they also had a hand in rescuing all those populations in this year.
Nice.
So I think it's really cool to sort of show how they've been there this whole time, but not really knowingly that they've been there. But I do want to point out that like it's mentioned multiple times in here that the Slann are like, they have these aeons long plans, and they're like shifting these small, they're playing this eternal chess game with chaos. And so generally when they're doing things like this, it sounds like their point of doing it isn't because they care in any way about the lives that they're saving. It's because they need them to do things to slow down chaos down the road. It's like we need Sigmar and all of his folks to live because they're going to be important to the great plan later on. It's very cold and calculating.
Sometimes it's easy to ascribe, like in the same way that people ascribe like emotions to like animals that are obviously not having those emotions. Like it's almost the same way for these Seraphon to think, they're nice and cool, man. They're friends. No, they don't care about you at all.
No.
They're just doing what they got to do.
Well, I think there's a couple examples of that where, well, one, it's kind of a step beyond Minority Report, like the idea of predicting a crime, where they're not necessarily judging where a race is going to chaos or not going to chaos. It's whether or not, even if they're never going to chaos and that group of elves is in the way of them doing something now, they might as well be part of chaos to them. Like, just eliminate that roadblock so they can get what they need to do to get the dominoes in line. And then the other side is there's, I think we talk about it in one of the, and probably a similar throwback because you were mentioning it, Paul, is, and we'll talk about them later, but the SOTEC do integrate with culture. And as you say that, Aaron, I'm thinking of it more as like they're mimicking, like they mimic what people do. They, I think we get a little bit of that in like Jurassic Park where they like, anyway, like just this idea that they're not really human, or even like there's nothing about them that's even close to human, but they can act the part sometimes.
Yeah, well, because they know that in doing so, it will advance their agenda. So, like, again, they do what they have to do.
Yeah. I think this is a very interesting story, like coloration, really, of the story of the retreat into Azir. Because the question then becomes, did Sigmar save the people of the realms? Or did the Seraphon, right? Did the Slann save the people of the realms? And there is this feeling now in current time of the mortal realms that Sigmar abandoned them, and now he's coming back, but there is this like sense of pride for having existed within the mortal realms. But is that feeling of abandoning actually Sigmar's fault, or is it the Seraphon and the Slann? Right? It colors that story heavily, and I think that's a super interesting little take.
Not going to say it.
Be the judge of that. Any other fun Age of Chaos stories? What happens after that?
Well, so one that's maybe less important from like a grand arcing narrative perspective, but to touch on the there's a bit here called the Blooded Claws where they talk about the Coatl's Claw constellation, which we can talk about them a little bit more later, but they're basically like all Saurus, or they're primarily anyway Saurus, instead of being led by a Slann. So they're much more savage than the normal groups, and they talk about like just their hatred of Skaven, and there was a meeting of Clan Pestilence and some Wanderers, and of course they just like went to town on the rats because they just absolutely hate them and killed them all. And at the end of it, the Wanderers were like trying to thank them and saying like, oh man, we were saved, like the gods saved us by sending these guys. But like it was to the point where they were at such a like bloodlust that they just kept killing, and they just killed all the wood elves too because the rats had them like up into such a fury. So it's like these guys aren't necessarily good in the sense that we might think of as good. They're sort of more of just an extermination force.
I don't like you laughing at a bunch of wood elf deaths. That's not cool.
Well, I mean, it's more just the complete lack of feeling and control that these guys have. It's like they just didn't even register that they were killing things that weren't really their enemies. They just, without control, the Saurus are just murder machines.
Yeah, well, it's a weird juxtaposition compared to the Slann, which are like, I don't know, the definition of control and patience, right? Like the fact that like their leadership is such a, I don't know, mindful bunch, to think that like the forces at their disposal could fall into such a bloodlust is again a jarring. Can't think of another word for juxtaposition because there it is again.
But for the Age of Chaos, I think these last two aren't super interesting, and like so the Blood and Scales story that they have in here is really just them talking about like killing daughters of Cain because they are like too close to Powers of Chaos in Ulu, and that it mentions, I think like the whole point of that story is that as the daughters stab some of them, instead of blood, there's just like light pouring out of them. So it's like just to emphasize them being imbued with the power of Azir.
All right, so yeah, I mean that I guess sums up the Age of Chaos. It's Seraphon doing what they can to strike back against chaos, right? Like it's chaos is sort of ascendant, but the Seraphon are still present in the mortal realms, or at least mortal realms adjacent, and striking out where they can, and making do with what forces they have available to, protect their interests and push forward the great plan as best they can. But eventually, as we all know, fortunately, the gates of Azir do open back up, and as Paul, do you want to say it?
Unreliable.
I'm looking for a lightning bolt.
Oh, lightning bolt.
Yep, the Stormcast come striking, and they're bringing the fight back to chaos. And it's I guess finally the Seraphon have allies again, fighting to push back chaos. Man, that's not exactly true.
More pawns on the table.
Yeah, they're not. I strike what I just said. They are not, in fact, allies, but rather they're sort of fighting with common cause. But the book makes it a point to say that they rarely do work together, despite the fact they're literally both, coursing with lightning in their veins. And so they'll give you each other a knowing head nod, maybe a salute here and there, but rarely are they literally on the same side of a battlefield fighting shoulder to shoulder.
Just wait till Black Library focuses on romance.
Ooh.
Loves a lizard.
Mm-hmm. So that's when the heavens open. That's the story from the Age of Sigmar. Did you guys have any pre-Chime of Tribulation stories you wanted to talk about?
I would like to talk about the Fleet's Ascend. This is a cool little narrative that actually makes its way into the rules and is super fascinating to me because it pairs together the lore that we had at the beginning of Age of Sigmar with the lore that we have now. And so when we're talking about High Azir, where all of these ziggurats are flying, these spaceships, as it were, they absorbed the power of Azir, and when they would descend in battle, right, the power of Azir would be present in all of their Seraphon warriors. During the Age of Sigmar, they actually descend into the realms. And so those ziggurats would actually come down and crash land, very nicely, pleasantly land, doesn't matter, within the realms. And then they would set up what they're called these Realm Shaper engines, which is the terrain piece that comes with the army. And wherever they are, they would create this jungle environment around a perimeter of the ziggurat. And within this jungle environment, they would have all of these amazing creatures and monsters that would become inhabitants of this area. And the difference is that once they land in the realms, they take on some aspect of the realm that they're in over the realm that they are from. And so we have these two specific designations. We have the Starborn, which are those which are from Azir, and then we have the Coalesced, which are those who are now in the realms. And there is a difference between the two of them, whereas one of them is Azir. If you land in the realm of fire, then you're going to take on some of that nature when you have spawning pools create new Seraphon in your ziggurat. It's a really interesting dichotomy that really helps to weave those two narratives together, but also makes for a really interesting choice narratively, whether or not you're going to be these super space aliens of magic, or you're going to be these more material beings of the realms.
No, isn't that does seem consistent though too, in that if their spawning pools in Azir took on star magic, when they go to any other realms, they're going to take on aspects of that realm. So that
absolutely.
I think it's an interesting distinction, or it's.
I'll be the judge of that.
Yeah, you will. Thank you. And I'll be looking for your vote. The but that it makes it special that there's the ones that are, called of starlight. But just thinking that, if they go to Gur, they're soaking up the energy either way, right?
And it does mention, I don't remember exactly where, I would have to look it up again, but that so there's still Azurite energy even in the ones that are living in the other realms, but as they live there, they absorb more of the magic of the realm that they're in, and so they become like infused with magic from both worlds. And so they start to take on new aspects, but the Azurite energy is always somewhat present. It's just not as prevalent as the ones who just live in the ships above Azir.
It's because home is where the heart is.
Well, the interesting point is that they clarify that spawnings still exist, right? We have this teleportation down from the Starborn, but as far as the Coalesced are concerned, there are spawning pools that do release spawnings, and this is definitely a mechanic that still exists within the army for the Seraphon, which I thought was a great callback and a good clarification.
Very, very cool. So this is basically the Seraphon reintroducing themselves in the moral realms, and although maybe not allying with the other sort of citizens or residents of the moral realms, is still they're having a more active role in fighting back chaos, especially now that they're being sort of bolstered by the Stormcast Eternals, who are sort of fighting on the same sides, if not necessarily shoulder to shoulder. Things seem to be going well, quote unquote, shoulder shrug. But then things get immensely worse when the time of tribulations and the Soul Wars hits. And as we found in some of the other Battletomes post Soul Wars, no one is immune to the effects of the actions taken by Nagash.
I think, it was mentioned before too, Phil mentioned it, how their actions are measured in eons or millennium or whatever. Like what's happening right this second everywhere is less important than like the long-term plan and those step-by-steps. And I think they say specifically Nagash's plan was such a long play and so like tediously minute in its like step after step that they didn't even see it coming. That the Slann who only think in 100-year increments or something like that didn't see Nagash's long plan coming, which is just, I love it. I think that it's fun having, because there could be this thing where they're so like high level that you couldn't ever pull one over on them. So it's nice to have just something where there's a blind spot or something like that for them.
And I think they mentioned somewhere, again, I feel like it's in here. I don't remember exactly what it, like the exact wording was, but I think it's basically like their plan is so focused on chaos, they weren't thinking about Nagash. And then it's like, we're just focused on the Chaos Gods, and we're going to do our thing to stop them. And then all of a sudden, Nagash is like, and here's my plan. And they're like, whoa, Death's doing stuff?
Yeah,
what?
Who's this guy? Nagash? Am I saying that right? I've never heard of him. And I think that it will circle back on that at the sort of the final point at this timeline, because that has some ramifications on it, obviously. Is wild that someone could be surprised, and kind of speaks to the importance and the shock that comes along with the Soul Wars type era, to think that like, yeah, these all powerful Slanns, like even they missed what was going on. So it sort of justifies the over 2 years that we've been talking about this thing for now. Like it really maybe puts a finer point on the fact that like, yeah, it was a monumentous event.
Yeah, and the cool thing I like is that it has a specific effect for the lizardmen that is kind of isolated from the rest. They do have there's ghosts showing up on the starships, and we lost some of our Slann because they were taken over by these ghosts. But for a narrative reason, It's very important because it actually jerked the Astromatrix Arcane out of the order that it was in. So those ley lines have now shifted, right? So places that were nexuses are no longer nexuses, and places that were completely unimportant have now become intensely important. So Nagash, because he was ignored, is literally allowed to shift the Great Plan into a completely different space, right? We're in new territory here.
It's kind of in the same way that like the Karajan overlords, like they had all those claims on their aether gold veins in the sky, and then like they all just got moved and shifted, and like, ah, crap, we got to do this all over again. You got to redraw lines and things. The Seraphon are like, yeah, no, I feel you, man. That's rough. It's interesting stuff. Furthermore, they make it a point to say that that everybody's sort of harnessing a lot of those endless spells, like throw off like the magic balance of the mortal realms too. So like there's another element of like magic being askew, kind of, and the fact that like the nadir in Shyish has been shifted, like that also is like poking a hole in the matrix. So like all in all, for folks who are very finely tuned into the magic of the mortal realms, they really were thrown for a loop. One of the fun stories is called The War on the Rim, as it sort of pits the Seraphon versus another newly discussed army, the Osiarch Bone Reapers. If you'll recall that episode, we talked about the Null Myriad, which is a sort of a subfaction of those Bone Reapers that are uniquely not immune, but resistant to magic. And so because of that, they can kick it on the realm's edge of a lot of different realms. And so there is a subset of Seraphon known as the Thunder Lizards, and we're going to talk about them a little bit. But they have been not hiding, but isolating themselves a little bit, protecting and hiding a number of old ones like machinery and inventions and technology. And so now that these Null Myriads have sort of popped up, the two are now at odds, waging a war, waging battles on the edges of any number of realms out there, sort of unbeknownst to the residents that are sort of living in more central locations on those realms. So there's these battles, these wars, these campaigns that are being waged that no one really ever knows about, between again these forces that are living in this inhospitable places in the realms, which is kind of cool. It's like these like hidden wars that nobody has any idea are going on, which I thought was kind of cool. Does anybody else have any other time of tribulations type stories they want to talk about?
I just wanted to mention too, one of the other things that they blame for their ley lines and stuff not working well is the bad moon. Getting a little too excited. So I thought it was funny that this little try hard is that again, another case where the grots and grot kind or whatever are punching above their weight.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got like a moon just like scattering about, like messing up their celestial like designs and constellations and stuff, which is kind of fun. Another example of you can really tell that the writers of this book really were making an effort to interject the Seraphon in a number of places, or have other things then affect the Seraphon, like to really weave them into the moral realms. Because one of the stories, I won't get into it, is but like apparently the Seraphon had a big involvement in the orb. What is it called? The orb Infernia. Yeah,
Infernia.
Orb Infernia. Yeah, from the malign portents like era of that campaign that we were doing, and then we shot a time cannon or something, and then the Seraphon like popped back into existence. Anyways, it's just they're slotted into a number of fun stories that we are familiar with. Kind of a revisionist history in a way. But that brings us to the present day with this history sort of under our belt. I guess I'll ask you guys, where do we find the Seraphon now? Like what is their goals? What's the situation they find themselves in? What are they after now?
Gone,
has
but
anything
not
changed?
forgotten.
Okay, cool. All right, that's Eric's answer. Beat that.
So if I were going to have my own constellation of Slan, I would call him Jefferson, so I could call it Jefferson Starship.
Okay,
there you go.
Sure. So that's 0 for 2 for getting at the answer I'm looking for. Let's see if Phil's got it.
The plans that the Seraphon are trying to enact now is they've realized, like, we got caught off guard. We weren't thinking broadly enough. We weren't being active enough in the Great Plan on a broad scale. Like, they're very focused. And so now it says that they're going to commence a new era of aggression in the mortal realms to sort of recapture the Astromatrix, get these ley lines back under their control, and really sort of stick it to all these other groups that are messing with the Great Plan.
Phil, can I tell you something?
Yeah.
That's exactly what I was looking for.
Oh, well.
I knew it.
I'm glad that I could help.
I can't believe you weren't looking for Jefferson Starship. That was gold.
That was my second. Well, it was the thing that I didn't know I was looking for. But yeah, like whenever we read these battle tomes, the question always on the table is always, what are they doing now? Like how do they, if they do push the story forward, how do they push the story forward? Or if not, how are they existing in the present day? Like in the present timeline, what is their activity, or what are they trying to do? And so like that, we have now identified their present purpose in the mortal realms. And it sort of justifies why they would be fighting everybody now, right? Like if they were so focused on chaos before, why would they be fighting against a Night Haunt army or a Gloomspite army? So like they have their reason to be doing so.
Well, and we have this interesting dichotomy now between the Starborn and the Coalesced.
Oh, you want to talk about Starborn and Coalesced? Let's do it.
Yeah. So the Starborn, again, are these Azir-tainted creations that are sent by the Slann in order to fulfill the Great Plan, right? Like, they seem to be still very much pure agents of the Slann that are sent down to the realms in order to cold-bloodedly, pun intended, either correct or create the grand plan of the Slann. And on the other hand, we have these Coalesced, which are literally within the realms. I imagine there has to be some aspect of the Slann of these Coalesced temples are absorbing some of the magic of the realms in order to hopefully get a better idea of what's going on in everywhere else besides the Age of Chaos, right? And get an idea of what every other army is. And these guys are definitely as well fighting along with the same grand plan, but it was explicitly mentioned that not all the Slann agree with what the intention of the grand plan is. And this will become an interesting dichotomy when we talk later about the constellations, because there is far more of an aspect of aggression in the Coalesced than there are in the Starborn. Right? The Starborn are kind of this like razor that is sent down to cut off a path. But the Coalesced tend to be more of a cleaver or some other more blunt instrument that is intended to control an area as opposed to necessarily correct the grand plan, at least in my mind, from my understanding of the reading.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. And I think that point about the Slann not all agreeing on what exactly the great plan is, I think is an important one in that so the Slann were birthed by the old ones. That's when the spawning of the Slann took place. And there were multiple spawnings, and like each subsequent spawning is like one more degree removed from the old ones. And pretty much there are no Slann left that had any direct interaction with the old ones. And so they're trying to remember what the original plan was. And so they all remember it just slightly differently. And they even mention in passing that like this even leads to conflict within the Seraphon, where some view the way in which some of the Coalesced are going about enacting the great plan, that it's like antithesis to how they're doing it. And they're saying, well, one of us has to be right. And they end up destroying one of the other groups.
Can I jump in real quick? Let's have a little listener question pause for a second, because I feel like we're touching on some stuff here. You guys you're highlighting a question raised by a member of our Discord, Timmy Mack. Hey, listener, if you want to ask questions about any of the shows that we do, the way to do so is to be a member of our Discord at www.themoralrealms.com/discord, and literally just wait around all the time for me to forget that we're recording an episode, and then remember at the last minute, and then ask everybody in the Discord channel, hey, do you have any questions for us? Literally like an hour before the show. But anyways, Timmy Mack, let's get back to Timmy Mack's question. He asks, given the fact that there are now two types, quote unquote, of Seraphon, would there be an in-lore reason why the two may fight each other? And I think you're answering that right now, Phil, and that, like, yeah, the different interpretations of the Great Plan could possibly lead them to blows if one group or one constellation felt that they were right and that the other constellation was doing things incorrectly and needed to be wiped out because it was a danger to the Great Plan. That right there would be prime reason for two groups of Seraphon to be at each other's throats. Do you agree?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, that's I believe pretty much verbatim what it says in the book, is that they one group will see that like the actions of the other are going to disrupt the Great Plan, and so they have to fight them. They have to stop them, because otherwise chaos could win, and they can't have that.
Well, God, no. And not only is it important that, for the good of the Great Plan, that they sort of eliminate some sort of deviation from that Great Plan, but furthermore, it also has an importance in that it almost is like a survival of the fittest kind of thing, or like a Darwinism a little bit, and that, like, if two opposing forces do end up coming to blows, the idea that, like, the strongest is going to end up winning, because they are sort of like bestial creatures in a sense, like, that's also important, that they want to make sure that the stronger army, the stronger your warband or whoever it is, ends up coming out on top, and it sort of filters or winnows out the weaker of the Seraphon, because they do also want to remain strong. That's also important as well, which is kind of a fun. I wouldn't have thought that would be the case, but here we are.
Yeah, I think that leads into another question from Frothy Cat is, does the lore cover what different realms of Coalesce might look like, or ways they should culturally diverge from the Starborn types? So I think the Starborn types, number one, they specifically glow with the light of Azir. It's called out and mentioned that is an appearance that the Starborn have. And they seem to be completely isolated within their starships in higher Azir. So they are completely indoctrinated, taught, whatever word you want to use, to the Slann that they are with. But the Coalesce are completely different in the fact that they exist within the realms. They live their life in the realms. And so they take on that aspect, and they lose that glow of Azir on their physical body. But because they do interact with society, even if it is just in war, there is more than just, I'm sending you to do war now, and you know exactly what I'm intending and how it's going to work. There are accidental skirmishes. There are other things that impact the Seraphon that are coalesced that the Starborn, I don't think, would have any concept of understanding, right? Defending territory is not something the Starborn would ever have to do. But the Coalesced have to do this on a daily basis. And especially when we get into the monsters, like, there's more of a understanding that this is their native land. Whereas Starborn don't have any conception, to my understanding, that this is where they belong. This is just where they are. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I do think, I was just going to say that they do talk about how the Starborn, in terms of like protecting things and being like, their spawning pools are a thing that they feel like they have to protect, and are aware that them being up in space is advantageous to keeping other things away. Although maybe one of the stories that was in Age of Chaos, maybe was it when Skaven did board one of the ships through gnaw holes.
It does sound familiar.
And so there have been cases where even in Azir they're not totally safe, and I think I like the sentiment overall, just in the point of like they do have to watch their backs and they do have to be cognizant of their resources in a way that is similar to the Coalesced.
We've been talking about how like they're different, but that's not to say that they don't have their similarities and are not, actually fighting on the, sort of the same side. Froth the Cat had another question where he wanted to know, do they have good reasons to work together, or do the Coalesced still follow the plans of the old ones? I think that's true. And then related to that, Travis from the Discord also was asking, is there any lore about the Coalesced and the Celestial working together in any way? Or are they kept pretty separate? I think oftentimes they are separate, but that's not the default. Like it doesn't mean that they have to remain separate. One of the stories in the timeline here, actually it's that last one talking about like their goals in the present day to sort of strike out and be more aggressive in the moral realms. It was a decision made by both the Starborn and the Coalesced to sort of work together and strike out and sort of reassert themselves in the moral realms. So they do have good reason, especially if their interpretations of the Great Plan sort of align amongst different constellations. As long as that's the case, they have no reason to be at odds, but rather are more than willing to work together to achieve their goals, which is reassuring at the very least. And then another question as it relates to Starborn and Coalesced, Tristan, Tomb King Tristan, friend of the show, he wants to know, how do you feel about the dual aspects of the book, the Coalesced versus the Starborn? Are they as to how they are represented in the lore? Is it 50-50 or is it more leaning on one over the other? Do you guys have any thoughts on that one?
I think lore-wise, the Starborn have been existing in the realms for far longer, but there's also a lot more interesting details about the Coalesced because they are in all the different realms.
And I think like the Coalesced are the way to, one, give the Seraphon sort of, they needed to have some skin in the game, right?
I think they have more scales, probably.
Well, probably. That's fair. Although,
Speaking of scales, in fairness,
skinks don't have a whole lot of scales. But, when you're flying around between realms, you don't have to really care beyond like the needing the astromatrix and stuff like that, what all is going on in the realms. But by setting up these colonies, and this is another thing that I think is interesting in that it sort of ties the two together, is that the Starborn are seeding the Coalesced. Like they always started out as Starborn. And so it's like you can imagine that they keep adding more potentially as they spread out through the realms. So there's sort of always this tie in some ways, but it helps give them a reason to sort of be involved in the overarching story. And then also, it allows them to move the story forward for the Seraphon, because otherwise it's sort of like, part of the problem with the original Battletome was sort of like, yeah, there's Seraphon, they've got spaceships, there's Slann on them, they, use their magic to create the lizards that fight. And then after the fights are over, they just go back to their spaceships, and that's kind of it. And so there needed to be some sort of mechanism to say, like, well, how do we move that narrative forward? And I think that the Coalesced naturally gives you a way to tie them in to everything else that's going on in the realms.
Yeah, it anchors them into like sort of the experience that we're used to, and makes a fairly alien race that much less alien in a sense. I mean, they're still jungle lizard demons, but still not demons. You had talked about the spaceships. Obviously, we've been talking about the spaceships quite a bit. They're in these ziggurats. They got their spaceships. They have the spawning pools. Do you guys have anything you want to talk about before I start asking some listener questions about that whole shebang? Anything else you want to add on that front?
Just a quick reflection that when the Seraphon decided that they were focusing too much on chaos, that it was exclaimed, "We're in a ziggurat." and it's time to change.
Yeah, that's a direct quote from the
It's right in the book.
Battletome. Yeah.
Yep.
Look it up.
I'm coming up with better intro lines as we go through.
If at any point you want me to slot one in, I will do that for you.
All right.
I feel like it's an outro line at this point, but that's fair.
Yeah.
Ned did ask the question, are there different spawnings of warriors like WHFB days, or do they do something different in terms of skin coloring and or aggression of preferences of tactics? There are definitely still spawnings. We talked about the fans of Sotek before, and we're going to talk about them a little bit later as well. They are specifically called out as the same coloration that was in Warhammer Fantasy Battle. But I would have to say that the way that they describe spawnings is not quite the same, because previously the spawnings would basically be all Saurus or all Skinks or some combination thereof. And it is called out specifically in the lore that you can have spawnings of Stegodon and spawnings of Bastillodons or Carnosaurs or of one individual warrior. From my understanding of the way that it was before, you would have a warrior that would rise from within a spawning. And that is not the way that it is anymore. If it's a particularly powerful individual, their spawning would be just them themselves. Phil, did you have anything to add to that?
I think I agree. I think the spawning pools that maybe people are asking about, that sounds, at least my reading was that is still Skinks and Saurus, but it was sort of like, depending on what, it's sort of like they could dial in a recipe and like that would determine what they were going to get out. And so like if they're like, oh well, we need knights today, so we need some Saurus that are good at handling cold ones, so we're gonna crank up the pools and get some Saurus that know how to handle cold ones. But it also mentions that they have like the Skinks run these spawning areas of eggs of the monsters that they use on the battlefield as well. So my understanding is that they do spawn the monsters, but it's not through spawning pools. They just sort of have very controlled breeding, it seems. They didn't go into much depth into how that works exactly.
Can I read a quote from the book real quick? Most constellations have racks upon racks of Stegodon eggs stored within their ziggurats, but the greatest spawning pools are also capable of producing fully grown beasts instantly when fed enough power.
Ah, well, I stand corrected.
In the coalesced like landings and kind of placements and that sort of stuff, they talk a little bit about skink spawning pools being kind of in the perimeters of the surface, where they may put their Saurus kind of deep into the temple that's buried underground as kind of and they're inside patrolling, and then they'd only come out when they're needed. So it sounded like you could set up designated spawning pools for different needs.
And now that I'm just reading this book, Eric, to answer your far previous question, what is a group of skinks called? Apparently Spawnkin. He chirruped an order before he and his Spawnkin disappeared back into the steaming jungle depths.
Wait, are you telling me you're just literally reading this book right now, Aaron, and you've never read it before?
He's just been making it up this whole time.
Guys, you see there's Slan. They look like frogs, and they drive spaceships.
And this is Eric, and the Slan said, "Who's ready for a Spawnkin?"
Okay. You can keep slotting them in. I'll tell you what. Just do a bunch of them, and I'll pick the best one.
I think one more thing to mention about spawnings. So they do touch on that the different constellations do all seem to have different colorings that are specific to those spawnings. And so like you can see this in the art. Sometimes there's ones that have like a red crest all the way down their back, starting at their head. Some of them have yellow. Some of them are, let's see, what are some of the other colors? I don't know. But the point being that like certain constellations have certain color schemes, at least according to the like heavy metal paint jobs. So there is some some credence to show that depending on which groups are spawning them, they are going to look different, and so they are distinct between the different constellations.
Paul, you had written skink barrios here. What could you have possibly meant? Explain yourself.
So this is a carryover from the old world into the new world. The skink barrios are an interesting concept that was very
I'll be the judge of that.
Spelled out in Warhammer Fantasy Battle. There is this class system of the skinks within the Seraphon society, where the especially powerful skinks become priests. But there's actually like 6 different kinds of priests in this book. And then they also have skink chiefs, but there's like 3 or 4 different kinds of skink chiefs. And the vast majority of the skinks are just kind of normal whatever, right? The skinks are still very much portrayed as the intelligent half of the Seraphon, and the Saurus are more like the dumb brute strength. There is some intelligence, but it is far more based in war than it is based in like understanding. So in the absence of the Slann, or more appropriately in the purpose of the Slann, the skinks are the ones who really run society. But within the skink hierarchy themselves, there is this class system where there are those skinks who are literally constantly fawning over the Slann at all times. And then they go down in order from there of this is the one who carries the message from the skink priest, the star priest, to the normal skinks, etc., to the skink chiefs who are just about leading war, to the skinks themselves. So the barrios are these outerlying structures that are not a part of the ziggurat, but they are a part of the society that the skinks grow themselves. The Saurus tend to just patrol, and I'm sure they have homes of some sort, but it's not specifically or explicitly mentioned. But the society itself is formed primarily from these different classes of skinks. And just the word barrio has an implication that I think is really interesting to investigate when we're talking about Seraphon society.
Cool. First of all, you just said the word skink a lot of times. Second of all, you've reminded me of a series of questions asked by another Discord member and listener of the show. Tomb King Tristan had some more. A couple skink-related questions. One of them was, why do you think a skink-led army would go to war? Does anybody have any thoughts on that one?
Well, the easy answer is that because they believe it's part of the grand plan and they're acting on behalf of the Slann.
Ooh, wrong. Actually, the right answer was to get to the other side.
Ooh, yeah.
Of the realm?
Mm-hmm.
There you go. Showed them.
There. I stand corrected.
Yeah. I think they talk a lot about how the skinks are, like, although second in command to the Slanns, they still have quite a bit of autonomy and oftentimes have their own opportunities to interpret the great plan they're like transcribing and translating a lot of that stuff. So it's not uncommon for skinks to either have their own decision-making process or they're able to enact the Slann's goals. And in doing so, like they could lead their army to go to war. I mean, like Paul said, there's like a billion different like hero type skinks, and any number of them could be inspiring their forces to march off. Phil, did you have any skink war related thoughts?
Well, I think it's another tie-in to the old world, right? We know that, so like Paul mentioned earlier with Sotek, Sotek is one of the skink gods, and skinks are generally religious. They have lots of priests. They're led by religious leaders primarily, and so they worship the old ones as gods. And so Sotek is like an embodiment of one of the old ones, and that's just how the skinks can imagine or like comprehend the old ones. And so they, each of these different gods that the skinks see is like their vision of one of the old ones, and they will fanatically follow these priestly teachings. And so like, I mean, this is reaching back to some Warhammer Fantasy stuff, but like the priests for Sotek would be like, we need sacrifices to Sotek, specifically if we can kill them, we need to get some of the Skaven, and they'd kill them by thousands on sacrificial altars, and so skinks would go on these more religiously driven wars rather than necessarily the Great Plan. But I mean, I'm sure it still is working towards the Great Plan. But if you were going to just have skinks fighting, on their own, that would probably be the main drivers, that the priests would be directing these things and inspiring them by saying, like, you're doing this for Sotek, or you're doing this for Itza, or you're doing this for, whoever.
You're just making words up now. He had another question related to skinks. He wants to know, do oracles feel like a powerful part of the army, or just a tacked on bit? Normally we don't get into depth on individual units, but I like Tristan, so I'm allowing it. What do you guys think? Oracles, do they feel like a powerful part of the army, or are they just tacked on?
I really like oracles because they are the physical embodiment of the will of the Slann, whereas typically the priests are kind of represented in the lore, at least to my understanding and reading, as people who are humanoids, that are trying to transcribe, understand a language that they may not be very competent in, right? Or they might be understanding tablets that have been written eons ago and attempting to translate them, iterate them into something that has meaning. The oracles themselves are the physical embodiment of the Slann's will on the battlefield, to the point where the Slann is allowed to use them as a channel in order to cast spells and to see across the battlefield. Am I right, Phil, or am I spitting spitballs here?
I believe that is correct. They've added a lot of emphasis on the oracles. I think in part because they didn't necessarily have a place before. They were just another type of skink. They had this affinity with troglodyns, which are these cave-dwelling bipedal monsters that are blind. And they make a big point about the double tail thing that they both have, and they're marked specially, and they rise up specifically as the only skink from their spawning. And so there's a lot of emphasis placed on them. I don't know how, I guess when you ask, are they a powerful part of the army? I guess from a lore standpoint, it feels like they're fairly important because they're conduits for the Slann. But if you're asking in terms of the game, that's another question. I'm not entirely sure.
If you look at the hierarchy, they're right up there with the Slann. They're literally on that same level. Now, obviously, we know that they aren't on the same level, but they are mouthpieces for the Slann, perhaps, or I don't know if they talk, but same idea. So they are up there for sure.
There's even as we get in a lot of the battle tomes, there's a breakdown of the sort of hierarchy of the army, and there's a flow chart of where does it, who's at the center and where does it flow out from them. And oracles are one step out and in no way down from the Slann. They're directly connected to them. Mm-hmm. Starseers and star priests are in the same vein, but they're not lower in the hierarchy. The oracles are just there. Like we said, conduits for the Slann.
Hey, since we're talking about units, maybe now's a great time, a perfect time even, for us to talk about some of our favorite units in the army, units, models, what have you. I'll ask Eric first to give Phil an example, but then I'm going to ask you next, Phil. So get ready. Eric, what's your favorite out of the range for whatever reason?
Man, absolute favorite. It is. Man, I feel bad because I don't want to take anybody else's, especially if Phil's got favorites. The Carnosaur is pretty awesome in terms of being a centerpiece model, being super dynamic, having all those options between the kit itself to build, having a rider on top of it. So I really like the Carnosaur. It's ferocious and I think it embodies the feral side as opposed to, some more docile big things that they have.
Now, do you find that obviously it's kind of modeled after like classic like bipedal like dinosaurs like in real life, that it's a little jarring to see how long its front arms are? Like, I understand it's not a T-Rex, I get that, but like, and yet looking at it, it just feels like its front arms should be shorter, right? Is that just me?
I was just looking at the model, thinking about modeling it with smaller arms.
Right?
So yes, it just feels like in our day and age, with all that we know about dinosaurs, it's just,
We'd probably just make it a less effective combatant, but still.
Now,
all right, Phil, was that enough time?
I mean, it's plenty of time, but I will sort of add on to the sort of Carnosaur bit there, and that so a little bit of dinosaur nerding out here a little bit. So the Carnosaur is based off of the theropod families of dinosaurs, because there's not just like a T-Rex. There's a whole bunch of these two-legged carnivorous dinosaurs. And if you just look up some pictures of different types of theropods that they've found, there's actually a number of them that have much longer arms than the Tyrannosaurus. So I think they probably, when the artists were doing this, they probably looked at a number of different examples and sort of picked and chose different pieces from the different ones that they liked. Some of this you can see in the Troglodon a lot, giving it that fin on its back. So,
man, I bet you guys didn't expect to learn something today.
Oh man,
did ya?
Yeah. I mean, if you want to cut this out, that's totally fine. I
No,
understand.
not at all.
We don't want to learn things here about real monsters.
No, exact opposite. I want another one. Maybe not now, but like by the end of this episode, I want you to drop me another fact.
Okay. But in terms of a favorite unit, I've always thought that the Saurus Guard, or as they used to be called, Temple Guard, were always super cool. And I think I like them. I mean, there's a couple reasons, but that, like, this idea of the Saurus as being like bred for purpose war machines, and that each different type of Saurus is literally born for a different role on the battlefield, I think is super cool. And that the Saurus Guard are literally born to protect the temples and the Slan. And like, this is even seen in the rules for how the Saurus Guard play on the tabletop. But like in the book, they talk some about like how Temple Guard in the ziggurats will just, they just stand still and they protect. And until something comes to disrupt what they're protecting, they don't move. They will just stand perfectly still and just wait, because that's their whole job. And like they'll dust will build up on them, and they're just standing like statues for however long they have to. And I think it's funny because they're so devoted to this cause that like it even mentions that if some skinks get like too close and are like overly energetic, that they'll just like cut them in half, and they'll be like, nope, nobody's coming in here. Like, got to keep the Slan safe. And it's just, again, it shows that there's like almost it's all instinct. There's no thought really. They have their orders and they're going to carry them out no matter what.
Those are pretty cool. I hadn't given them a second thought before you started talking, and now I'm enthralled. Now I love them too. Your enthusiasm is infectious. Paul, make your favorite unit my favorite unit. Tell me about them.
Well, it's obviously the Stickadon for me. I have 4 of them. I have 2 of the old metal ones. I have 2 of the plastic ones.
I didn't know that. That's cool.
But they were the core of a Southlands list in the Old World, and I have an Old World Southlands list. If I could pick an old unit, which I can't, I'd pick Teeny Weeny and his Cold One Riders, which were a unit of skink Cold One Riders that I bought like 3 boxes worth of. So,
oh man, those are worth some big money nowadays.
Yeah, not when I've assembled them and converted them, etc. But
I mean, that's fair.
Fair. But the Stegodon kit to me it was such a revelation when it came out. I love both of the builds of it. The giant bow is one of my favorites, and the Engine of the Gods as well is just, it's such a cool design. And really, if you look back upon it, you can see that it was a precursor to the amazing kits that they can make now. Plus, it's also one of those amazing kits where you get the monster, you get the models, and then you get 2 hero types. So regardless of which build that you build, you're going to get a skink chief or a skink priest that's going to be extra. And you can build it completely even when you build the entirety of the other build each time you do it. So that, like, it's a super cool kit. It goes together really well. I love the platform that it's on. It was one of the first kits that also really told the story about the race in the platform that's on the back of the Stegodon. And it's just amazing. I think it's one of the best models they've ever done.
I think you just like Howdas.
I do like Howdas.
Is that your secret?
I do like Howdas because it's an integration of the background. It's an integration of 2 units into one. I like the Arachnarok Howda because of the possibilities that are in the kit, right? It still has a chief. It still has a priest, a magic user, and it has the basic other models. I like the kits like that because if you really wanted to and are absolutely crazy like I am, you could build an entire army out of just the models that are on the back of the Arachnarok or just the models that are on the back of the Stegodon. And they have such a cool presence and just they command attention that it blew me away when I put them together. And I still love them to this day. It's just, that was the first, like, oh my goodness, I can't believe that this is possible to do with plastic kit. And even though it's, at this point, it's like, 12, 13 years old, it still is just an amazing kit, and I love it.
Right on. My favorite model, or unit, I guess, is the Bastiladon, actually. So I'll join you like in a big dinosaur model, but I'm going to pick this guy. I would say that, right off the bat, I would say maybe the Ankylosaurus is one of my favorite dinosaurs for whatever reason. And so obviously this is inspired off of that. So I like the idea that when you have an army of dinosaurs, like the diversity of like form and shape can be so effective, like on a battlefield. And it's not just a matter of finding, dinosaurs that have big jaws or big claws or, all teeth or spines and stuff. Like there's ways to integrate other shapes and functions into this army. And so if you were to create a dinosaur tank, and literally like a tank, like a classic, or like a tank as we know it today, like what would you do? So it's got to be heavily armored. So obviously the Ankylosaurus is involved there, but obviously it's going to have a heavy payload on top. Like it's going to have a projectile or a shot that needs to be done. Well, how do you translate that into like a Aztecian dinosaur army? Well, what can we use? What motifs do we have available to us? So like that gem on the back of it, the what is it? Solar something, solar engine, I think. Yeah. Like to translate that into a projectile is such such an inspired choice. So I think the combination of the two are awesome. Like you've got this slow moving tank in this dinosaur army, and it's sort of it's a direct translation 1-to-1, and I think it's a great execution. However, I will say the dual box kit, because it's got the Archaeopteryx on the back too, is nonsense and a terrible idea, and I do not like it one bit. If I understand correctly, there's a mini realm gate inside that Archaeopteryx, and it's spitting out snakes. Seriously, who thought that was a good idea? Ugh.
I mean,
get out of here.
for the fangs of Sotek, super cool.
You can make mini realm gates, and that's what you choose to do with it? That's nonsense. Get that out of here. But the solar engine is legit, and I think that's really, really neat.
Fair.
Cool.
I do want to just quickly mention the Croxagore while we're on units, because I don't know that they're going to come up in any other sense. So from a lore perspective, the Croxagore are important to mention because they're like the heavy laborers. So Paul was mentioning how like there's this classed society, and so you've got skinks who are both administrators and craftsmen, and then you've got Saurus who are the fighters, and then the Slan who are the overlords. But the builders are Croxagore. And Croxagore, for the most part, I think have sort of been left out a bit. I think this is partially due to the fact they have really old models, and like I'm not sure they know what they want to do with Croxagore yet. So there's just not a huge emphasis on Croxagore, but they look a lot like Saurus, but they're like way bigger and way beefier, and they're just like, I don't want to say that they're dumb,
Because they might hear you.
well, I think it's less that they're dumb, and it's more that they just don't have any sort of like conscious will. Like they just do what they're told. They don't think. And so like they're always hanging out with skinks, and the skinks are always telling them like, okay, this is what we need you to build now. And they're like, okay, whatever, we'll just do this. And they like never get tired, and they're huge and they're strong. And so like in the lore and on the battlefield, they're supposed to be like directed by skinks, but then they've got these huge hammers and they just go and smash things' faces on the battlefield because they're mindless, and that's just what they do. And I think it's interesting that there's like this whole subsection of the society that is only mentioned in like a unit entry, and that's it. Like they don't really show up in the lore at all.
I love ogre-sized things, and the Croxagore are that.
They sure are.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely that place for them, and I definitely would love to have seen new models for them, because I think that the reason I like that size is you can put details on them like you do in the bigger models that we've been talking about. Part of the reason we love the Carnosaur and the Bastillodon and the Stegodon is because they're big, have a lot of detail, and they, they give us a vibe. And these guys do too. And you make them big and give them lots of detail, and they can really show something. Like I feel like the Saurus Sunblood, the Old Blood, and like those guys are just almost small enough that you lose the detail of their scales or the detail of all the ornate stuff on them. Like it is super cool. But making that just a little bit bigger, I think, would be perfect.
Definitely agree.
I miss the old lore for the Croxagore where they were like buddy with the skinks. Back in 8th edition, you could run a unit of skinks with Croxagore inside of it. And there was this like just cool, like, I don't know, symbiosis between the skinks and the Croxagore where they would gather around them because they could be protected when they were around them, but also they could completely control the Croxagore in any way that they wanted to. And so I miss that kind of specific direction.
Cool. Any other units you guys want to talk about before we move on?
Oh my god, they have so many. They have like 33 different units, so let's not.
Yeah, this is a huge range. All right, so these units often are deployed in a number of what I generally will call subfactions, but here are constellations. Like most recent armies these days, there are these keyworded subfactions that can be sort of deployed, and they've got their own story to be told. Let's talk about some of our favorites. I'm gonna have Phil do it. Tell me about your Coatl's Claw.
So I think this is one of the new ones. I'll say that the Dracothian's Tail and Fangs of Sotek have already existed in the BHB 1 and 2, I believe. But so those were just for the Starborn. The two new ones, Coatl's Claw and Thunder Lizard, are for the Coalesced. And I think that each one of these sort of gives you a view into a different aspect of Seraphon. So at a high level, Dracothian's Tail is Slann focused, Fangs of Sotek is Skink focused, Coatl's Claw is Saurus focused, and then the Thunder Lizard is focused on the big monsters. And I think being able to dive into the Saurus is really interesting, and the way that they sort of give reason for that is that their Slann ends up getting incapacitated, and so this whole constellation, like they're in Gur, they've lost their Slann, they don't really know what to do, the skinks are freaking out, and so the Saurus just step up and are like, they do what they're supposed to do, and then like when there's no Slann on the battlefield to command everybody, they're the ones to take over. And so these old bloods sort of basically just take control of the whole constellation, and so they become this, as we talked about earlier in the Age of Chaos, that they're this very feral, very savage group of Seraphon that like make a point of just churning out tons of Saurus, and they're constantly trying to just fight and kill, and like they're described as being frenzied, and like they're this very different feel from what we used to see as Seraphon in their original Battletome and in the BHBs, because previously they were all about like teleporting and magic and very controlled, and they're just the complete opposite of that. And I think it's really interesting that they were able to give you this juxtaposition of within one army you can have something that's completely polar opposites. And I think there's going to be a lot of players who probably like something more like Coatl's Claw, because it might feel a little bit more like old world Saurus, where everybody's just on the ground chopping people up.
Yeah, intense. Very cool. We'll have Paul talk about his Fangs of Sotek next. Lay it on me, Paul.
The Fangs of Sotek are the skink-based constellation. They are a direct descendant of Tehane Huanin from the old world, the prophet of Sotek, and his red-backed skinks. So there is a strong feeling of poison, and as Phil mentioned as well, there is a strong theme of sacrifice running through this constellation. The Fangs of Sotek are the ones that you're going to see if you're in the cities of Sigmar, because they actually send their skinks to live in the cities, which is kind of a unique aspect in the lore. They are not integrating in society per se, but they do coexist in these cities. They build their own buildings. They live among the people, but they do require blood sacrifice, and there are people that do disappear that end up on the altars of Sotek, which is a cool narrative hook for the army, but also just a cool idea of this order force coming in that's against chaos, but they're going to still make sacrifices to appease their god. And it doesn't have to be a chaos worshiper that's sacrificed. It's just somebody that is given their blood so that they can continue to worship their god. When Phil was talking about religious fanaticism, this is the constellation of religious fanaticism. So it also feels very much like me as a direct descendant of the Southlands from the old world, which I also super appreciate, because I thought that was cool lore, a cool background. So I'm very happy to see this in the book and to see the lore explored a little bit.
I think one thing that I think is fun that they mention is that while they're like sort of stealing people away to make these sacrifices, that the inhabitants of most of the free cities tend to blame the daughters of Cain for all of the blood sacrifice. Like nobody's thinking about the skinks. I just think that's a fun dig there.
It's a little too fun. I'm a fan of the Thunder Lizard, and it's not the Thunder Lizards, which I don't really understand the titling here, but so be it. I had mentioned before that it's not uncommon for the Thunder Lizard group to find themselves on the realm's edge. So what their jobs are typically is they're tasked with protecting and utilizing when necessary the ancient technologies of their old one gods. And so they have all these machines and engines of war and things that they may or may not really understand how to use, but they're protecting them and keeping them safe, or at least trying to, on the realm's edge. It's not uncommon, though, that like treasure hunters catch wind of these folks, or like I said, maybe the null myriad of the Ossiarch Bone Reapers still find their way to the edges of these realms and try to, whether take them over or capture this technology. They have a strong connection to Shaman for whatever reason. I guess maybe that relates to machinery or machinations or what have you. And so because of that, they have a predilection to collecting. What is the realm stone? Shamanite, but I guess maybe any other realm stone of the different realms as well. And they are known to sort of kick it back to their home, like to teleport it back to their home base, and then actually like sort of imbue their beasts, their monsters with it. Because another component of this group, actually they've got a lot going on, is not only just that they're interested in the machinery of the old ones, but then they're also really big into their I guess they're monsters, right? They're stegodons, they're bastillodons, they're carnosaurs. And so they take that realm stone I was talking about, and they like imbue some of its power into their monsters. And this, because of that, their monsters are that much more strong. I think on the game, in a game sense, like they have the ability to like have a whole army full of like stegodons or something close to it, right?
Yep.
They featured that on Warhammer.
Stegodons gold battle line.
Yep.
And then they
exactly.
get +2 attacks on all of their monsters
plus
too.
2 wounds on all of their monsters.
Plus 2 wounds. You're right. I apologize. Plus 2 wounds.
That is wild. So again, they've got a lot of things going on. They got a lot of moving parts. But like it kind of goes hand in hand that the machinery of the old gods or the old ones is often strapped to the back of a dinosaur, and so that's kind of how they work there. It's interesting. They just have a little side where they have like a complicated relationship with like the Sylvaneth, because although oftentimes being on order they have common goals, like the after effects are up for debate between whether or not like it's a rigid control over like nature, where the Seraphon want to use their realm shaper engines to, make jungles and stuff, versus sort of the natural progression of the Sylvaneth. And so they may be wiping out like chaos forces, and then the next in the next breath be at each other's throats because differing of opinions on how to proceed. So I think those guys are legit, mainly because they just have a bunch of monsters, which is the coolest. Cool. We got one more. It's the Dracothian's Tale. I'm going to throw it to Phil, being the guest. And also, he seems to know the most about this stuff.
So, I mean, I think Dracothian's Tale is maybe sort of like the most vanilla of these constellations.
The hammers of Sigmar of the Seraphon.
Yeah, basically. So Dracothian's Tale, they're known for like using teleportation and like striking in these precision, like they launch attacks exactly where they need to be, exactly when they need to be there, and like that's sort of their calling card. Their Slans plan out things using the temple ships very specifically. It's called out that they specifically have more Star Masters than most other constellations, and they fight just in this very hit and run sort of way. They'll show up, they do what they need to do, and then they beam back out and they fly off to go do the next thing. And so it really leans into that teleporting mechanic that the Seraphon have had before. And they then also make the point, like as the name would suggest, that in some way Dracothian sort of, for whatever reason, looks favorably on them, and so it's not explicitly called out, but it sounds like Dracothian has a active interest in this group, and that like as they take on battles that like this specifically says that like the celestial bodies grow brighter above wherever Dracothian's Tale fights. So it suggests that Dracothian is taking an active interest in wherever they go. So not really a whole lot of other like story behind them, except that they're like teleporting and stuff, but still really cool nonetheless.
Yeah, well, they seem sort of to personify like the original Age of Sigmar, like Seraphon, like viewpoint. Like they encompass that idea, and now the other ones have sort of expanded beyond what was the classic interpretation of what Seraphon was. Right on. All right, well, let's talk about some special characters. Every army's got at least one, and this army is no exception, I guess. Yeah. So who wants to talk about Lord Croak? And my question specifically is: has Lord Croak changed at all, or is he the same old mummy frog that we have grown to love?
I think in short, he is the same old mummy frog because he is literally the same mummy frog. They packed him up in one of the ships, and he's come along for the ride. And every so often, they'll roll him out on his stone chair, and he explodes and uses celestial deliverance to wreck people.
Well, so for folks who don't know, I guess let's maybe rewind a little bit.
Sure.
Who is Lord Frog, and what separates him maybe from the other Slan?
Well,
And besides the mortal coil,
Lord Croak is the oldest, quote, living Slan that's alive. The twist is that he's no longer technically alive. He was actually killed ages ago and mummified, but his spirit is still bound to his body. And because of that, his spirit is so strong that he is the most powerful Slan. He is the oldest Slan, and he's still able to affect change upon the mortal realms through his desiccated body, right? I mean, number one, you got to take some moment to appreciate that the pun of Lord Croak about a dead Slan frog is the only character in the book, and how amazing it is that that's one of the only things that survived from Chi Huichi and Tanwanin and all these ridiculous names that they came up with. That Lord Croak is the one that, yeah, exactly. So you got to take a moment to appreciate that. But he is, as it were, the guiding light of the Seraphon, because he is the oldest and most respected being within the race.
Oh, I get it now. It's because he's croaked. I get
exactly.
Okay. Sure.
There you go.
He's
there
a frog.
You go.
He's dead. And he also, if you think about it, his temple or ziggurat did not have to go into suspended animation for him because he's already dead. He doesn't need to be fed. He doesn't need to sustain himself, right? Because his spirit is so strong.
That which is dead cannot die.
Exactly.
Yeah. Speaking of special characters, another solid question from Toon King Tristan. Unfortunately, I know that the answer is going to be solid, but he wants to know, what are some characters that they mention in the book other than Lord Croak? They exist. There are other names in this book. Did any stand out for you guys? I feel like I know the answer to this.
So there's other Slan that are mentioned by name a couple of times, but really they're not important. They do make a point of saying that I think it's Zektoka is the Slan of the Fangs of Sotek. So we do know that if you really wanted to, you could say that your Slan is actually this character in the lore, but there's no elaboration of who this person is. It's just a name that's attributed to a Slan, and that's about it.
Yeah, it does lend a little bit of credence to the idea that the entire race is guided by this grand plan. So it's not the individuals necessarily that make the difference. It is the sticking to the plan, right? And it is, it is the individual Slan who makes the decision to land the ziggurat and become coalesced as opposed to starborn. And so the characters themselves are not important for their individuality. They are important for the actions they have achieved, which I think is a kind of a cool way of embodying the lore.
Neat. Any other thoughts about that? Because now we've got space for a little bit of a free-for-all. Do you guys have any other points of interest in this book that jumped out at you that you thought were particularly compelling? I've got one, but I'll let you guys go first.
I have a couple, but Phil, you can go first.
Of course you do.
I think we've touched on most of the stuff that I wanted to talk about. We've covered a lot of the story and a lot of the interesting points there's always a little bit more that you could talk about here and there, but I think we hit on the main things.
All right, I'm going to go with, I got three things. There was a mention of a group of people called the Moon Monks of Hish.
Oh, yeah.
Which I thought was a super cool little thing, and how they were they were the closest to be able to understand what was going on during the Age of Chaos or something like that. I might be a little bit off on that, but that just the Moon Monks of Hysh sounded like an awesome army idea, whatever.
They were mentioned as like one of the because they specifically spent a lot of time just like watching. They're basically astronomers, right? Like their whole thing is that they contemplate the heavens a lot, and it even says that like by accident they sort of started to learn about the Seraphon because they were seeing these things that the Seraphon were doing because they control the heavens and they adjust the constellations to help them in battle. And so they make the point that like some of this knowledge in the mortal realms for the Seraphon is coming from these groups in Hysh because they just happened to notice them.
So that was the first kind of cool call out that I liked. The second one was the Woad Lords, which were mentioned by name, which I really appreciated because that feels like to me a callback to the Albion campaign, which is it's kind of a deep cut, but it was back in I think 7th or 6th edition. It was a worldwide campaign that was basically a medieval version of England called Albion that had a couple of really cool models come out that I think that still stand up. The Albion Truthsayer was one of the cool ones, the Fen Beast. There was Hengist the Druid and his 2 giants as well. And so I feel like that's a cool callback and perhaps a seed that might be explored later in another campaign if we're lucky. And the last kind of cool thing was that there was a mention that there are salamander skulls in the Fire Slayer Lodge treasure vaults, which says that perhaps the Seraphon actually did arrive in the realms earlier than we know, but we don't have much to go on to understand what actually happened, which is a cool thought.
Cool. Yeah, right on. One thing that stood out to me, I guess, is the idea that they Seraphon have a unique relationship with endless spells, and they can actually have bound endless spells. Just as a highlight to show that like the Slann have such a mastery over magic that like even these like very destructive, like oftentimes uncontrollable endless spells are mere playthings to our Slann here, and I like that. Over some of the more recent Battletomes that we've seen, they've made an attempt to have armies have sort of a unique interface with endless spells, or having their own take on how endless spells sort of work for them. The other example being how the KO can like pocket an endless spell and release it from a bottle or something. But it just goes to show that endless spells aren't necessarily the sort of tacked on supplement, but rather they can permeate through the different armies and have different uses or ways to be utilized with these forces, which I thought was pretty neat. Cool. Any other points of interest? Eric, do you got any points of interest you want to talk about?
I think, yeah, I mean, I still like trying to figure out, like we talk about Alien, we talk about, something that's so different, it's often talked about with like, in 40K, like the Tyranids are just this mindless race of devourers, or, even with like the Eldar or elven races, that they're so intelligent or have lived so long that we can't possibly relate to them. And I feel like the Seraphon should be perceived in a way that's even harder to relate to in an interesting way, which may be why some of those, like tic-tac-toe and stuff were removed a little bit. Like they definitely had a lot more jokes as part of their history, but now they're a lot more mysterious. And every time I think they mention, the Slann know, but they won't tell, I picture, a Slan looking over its shoulder at the camera going, tee hee, tee hee. So there's, if you want to interject some humor back into it, there's a mystery there. It's pretty fun to have that aspect of them. So.
Yeah, I definitely feel like Jimmy Vedok did not write this book because he's the one who came up with all those ridiculously wonderful puns. So I do miss that a little bit.
Cool. So we have a couple more listener questions. Let's see if we can burn through them real quick. Ned, Never Dead Ned, though he changed his name recently, so I'll just call him Ned, has a question. He wants to know, how does the lore hold up compared to the Warhammer Fantasy Battles lore with them? I feel like we've been doing a lot of talking about old Warhammer Fantasy. How do you guys feel? At least maybe the folks who know a little bit about it. How does the lore hold up? How does it compare?
I would say it definitely holds up, but at the same time, it doesn't hold up just because there was so much time to explore in the old world. The idea of having Lustria and then the Southlands is something that's not really explored in this book because it is the realms. And so the realms become kind of shorthand for those different areas. So I wish there was a little bit more explanation of exactly how that worked. But at the same time, I don't feel like the Battletome is lacking exploration of the lore. And I think it, for me at least, fully satisfied my understanding of how the race is developed in the Mortal Realms and how they're going to move forward.
Yeah. And I feel like you don't necessarily have to compare them because it's not like there was an end and a beginning. They make the point that it's like, this is a continuation. Unlike some armies, there is no break really between these two things. So the Warhammer Fantasy Battle lore is still the lore of the Seraphon. It's just a long time ago.
In a galaxy far, far away.
Literally. So in that sense, I kind of like that. I think it was good to, rather than trying to like completely start over and give them a whole new backstory, like it would have been so hard to try and separate them from that because they're in their spaceships that literally came from the old world. That like I appreciate that they understood that like the only way that we're going to make this work is that we still have to have some connection there, and I think they did it in a pretty good way.
Cool, right on. I'll ask, maybe continuing on that theme. Darth Alec wanted to know. He wants to know how wants to know a lot of stuff actually, but one of them is how retconny is the new lore. Did you guys find it retconny either from a Warhammer Fantasy perspective or a just previous iteration of the Seraphon perspective?
I mean, I feel like for it to have been retconned, there would have had to have been something for them to have retconned. Like, there was so little lore in the first book that, like, all they were doing was just writing the story this time. Like, they just didn't do it the first time around. While you could probably say that, like, yes, that's retcon. You're going back and writing their backstory now that you know what's already happened. The fact that they just kind of didn't do it in the first place means that this is sort of the first take. There's not really a retcon in my mind.
I would definitely agree. I don't think there is a retcon at this point. It is further exploration of the background, but because they have the Starborn and the Coalesced, it allows the Starborn for me is the old lore, and the Coalesced is the new lore, and they coexist side by side. I think really well and in an interesting way. So to me, there is no retcon.
Interesting, because to me the Coalesced. So it's not. I would also say it's not a retcon, but Coalesced is the old world, and giving people back kind of their ability to play in that in the physical world, like be in their temples in the jungle. Whereas a big, part of the big kind of pushback about the original lore is it wasn't like Phil said, it wasn't grounded enough, or it was so different from what they knew that we got the Coalesced because of that. But I love that they didn't change other than making maybe the remember. I really enjoyed the remembered part of it, like that the Slann were so powerful that they could, imagine the magic of the stars into tangible things and have them fight. I'm fine with the idea that they've made that into like, it's just the way it appears, like, science so advanced that it looks like magic. So that's my take on it. Is I love that they kept, the star magic and the, veins full of star magic, etc. But then also gave players who've been playing a long time their jungles back. So I think AOS has room for all of that. And we were, a lot of people said that from that first book, like there's room for all of it. And I think this book just makes room for all of it.
Yeah, I think our answers are kind of progressively going from one end of the spectrum to the other, whereas we started with not thinking it was retconny. I think it, I don't know, I felt a little retconny going through it, and I don't necessarily mind the direction they went with. Like, that's fine, and I'm cool with them sort of correcting some, what we might even call mistakes from the previous one. But like to Eric, what Eric was saying, like they did explicitly say that like the Seraphon were like memories, and now they aren't. Like that has changed, and they did a fine job trying to explain that. Like, oh, it's like, again, like Eric said, sure, to the untrained eye, it seemed like this, but like when I read that sentence, it was very obvious that like, oh, I see what they're doing here. They're fixing that previous thing. Like, and in my mind, that's the definition of a retcon. Again, justified. I'm fine with it. I don't mind it. But like, it is what it is. Like, that is what they
Fighting
did.
words.
I mean, they used to have the demon keyword, and now they don't. Like, that's now a difference and sort of a change of a previous iteration. So if I could see how that could bother someone, maybe that some other person was wedded to the idea that these were demons or memories or what have you. And if that's the case, yeah, that's not here anymore. That's gone. And sorry to tell you that. But then also to Eric's point, I'm fine with the direction they went, and I agree that there is room to have both the old and the new. The old world is very much, I like we said, sort of a grounded perspective on it, and then you take the Starborn and you sort of ramp up what Seraphon are to 11, and sort of introduce that very high fantasy out of this world element to the Seraphon. It makes them fit, I think, probably a little bit better when compared to the other armies that exist in this setting. So I'm down with it. Darth Alec also wants to know, what do you feel about the lore going back to the old ones and the Great Plan after abandoning it during the End Times and the first Seraphon tome? And then I think he had an addendum. How do the old ones jive with the mortal realms were created post End Times lore as per the core rule book? So he's interested about old ones and how they fit with the current setting. How do you guys feel about that? Deep thoughts from Phil.
So the old ones are that we could start getting into some fairly, like, I feel like, I don't know, I think they need to be careful with the old ones, like starting to sort of say that like, oh, they created all this stuff that exists. Like, it starts to elevate them to this level of being like the creator forces of the mortal realms almost. And I think you almost, I don't necessarily want that to happen, because I think it starts to like, it begs more questions then of like, well then how did the old ones do that? And like, what parts of the mortal realms then still have direct influence from the old ones? And you start getting onto these tangents that I don't think need to exist or should exist. I think it's in a good place for the Seraphon, where it's like they have old ones technology, they're still following the plans of the old ones, even if maybe at one point it seemed like that was not going to be the continued direction for the Seraphon. But I think it just gives them a strong throughput for the army to say like, this is why they're doing what they're doing, because I think every force needs to have that, to give people a sense of like, an army needs to have a purpose for you to be able to comprehend why they'd be doing what they're doing in the realms. And I think the old ones fill that need really well for the Seraphon. But like I said, a little wary of starting to make them like the progenitors of the mortal realms. That's, I think, maybe not a good direction.
I'd agree with that. I mean, I think that part of my statement of wish they had said that the Slann made the realm gates was to give more agency to the Slann and the Seraphon, and I think to the point too where having old ones that had a plan and then everybody has a different way of interpreting it, to me undermines the idea that they have like a guiding point. I'd almost rather there be the Slann are so intelligent that they each have this master plan of how they would go about eradicating chaos, but there's just just a slight difference in their spawning or their origination or their perspective that they come into conflict. So part of me would rather not have the old ones and give the elevate the Slann to kind of being kind of in that position, like make them more mysterious or make them more elevate them more. But that's me.
I'm gonna hang my shingle on that old standard of the unreliable narrator, because I don't think that we can take this as an authoritative history, especially because it's in the Seraphon Battletome, right? Like,
you mean this isn't real?
So, well, what I'm saying is that you can't say that because the Seraphon believe that the old ones created the realm gates, that the old ones actually created the realm gates, right? Like, what we're exploring here in the Battletomes that I really enjoy is we're exploring the idea that we have an oral history that is passed down instead of a written history for the vast majority of this. It doesn't matter where the person starts their story, because this person is telling the authoritative version from this perspective. And I think it's a much more palatable and a much more interesting story if you approach it from that way, as opposed to trying to take everything that's written in the Battletomes as a gospel truth.
So what I'd say though is I agree with you that in the story that it's presented as unreliable. I think Phil and I are stepping outside of what's written into what GW has chosen to pose or make part of the story. So it's very much intended that you believe or that you buy into the idea of the old ones from how it's written. And I'm saying as a choice from the editors or from the storytellers, that the old ones doesn't do much for me as a device. So not how it's used, like whether whether the person in Hammerhall is meant to believe in the old ones or not isn't the point I think I'm trying to make. It's more of, I think there are other more interesting things to play off of that don't exist, that they didn't choose to do, but whatever, so it's.
I love the old ones because there is no evidence that they actually existed. And I love that callback to them because it is the nebulous, undefined primogenitor idea, right? Like, to me, that is such a cool idea because it could spawn so many theories, could spawn so many ideas of how this actually plays out. And because there already is that kind of like social history on forums, on Twitter, etc., I appreciate tapping back into that well for this idea, because I don't think that well is dry. I think there's a lot more that could be said and could be done. And so I understand that it would be cool to have a new idea. It'd be cool to have the Slann do the realm gates, but I don't want the Slann to have that much agency. They already have so much agency being able to control their entire races, that giving them that much agency would actually tilt the setting into a place that I would not appreciate, because it allows them to have more power than I think any race should have. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but they can already control what the realm gates do. Like, so building one's not a stretch beyond that. Like, the old ones are into, practically, did they create the realms, right? That's it. I'm not looking for that level, but I'd rather the realms have just been created out of, whether it's the explosion of the old world or because these elder gods like the Dracothian, breathed fire in a certain way. So yeah, the people that the great old ones made this isn't as interesting to me. So that's all I'm saying.
From my perspective, I don't know that I care one way or the other if the old ones exist. To the point about whether or not they jive with the mortal realms being created post the end times, I think it still works. I don't think there's necessarily any sort of plot holes that would prevent that from making any sense, and that the old ones very well could have done what they did with the old world, and still had a hand separately in the sort of creation of the moral realms or the guidance of it, or maybe they found it later and shaped it a little bit. Given we're dealing with things of such immense power, I think the timeline can work such that they could have been involved really at any point. And whether or not they directly created the realm gates or, had the Slan do it later, or, a joint effort, all this isn't precluded by the way the story's been told thus far. So I think it's, I'd be willing to be corrected if somebody has any examples of why it doesn't line up, but I think it still does.
Yeah, I guess it's the question of I think Phil brought it up, were the mortal realms created as a result of the old world blowing up, or did they exist here prior to the old world? Do we have a sense of that?
I'm under the impression that they were created because of the end times, but that doesn't mean the old ones couldn't have still been involved when they were created. Is there something that flies in the face of that?
No, so only in that in the old world, the old ones were before, which would put the old ones as active agents between the end times and Age of Sigmar, which would make them less old.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Like, do we think they don't exist today anymore, or are they like long gone?
I mean, I don't think that question is ever really, like, they've always been this mysterious race that came to wherever and then did stuff, whether it's seed a species or build technology or whatever, and then they fly away and then they're just gone. So, I mean, I don't see any reason why they couldn't have then seen, like, hey, there's this new place, let's go check that out. Like, we just don't know anything about them. So, like, it's so open-ended that I don't see how they're, like, that there's really a reason that there couldn't be this connection. But it's again, it's a very powerful, supposedly, race of beings, like, on like the same level as like god beasts, I guess, is probably the closest thing we have in Age of Sigmar to that same level, because it certainly sounds like it's above the pantheon gods. It feels like it's so undefined that they could really be doing whatever you want. Like, and then there's also, like, I think we touched on earlier that, like, Necrons potentially could be a creation of the old ones if you wanted to, like, tie the two universes together for 40k and Age of Sigmar and Warhammer Fantasy. And I think they leave that kind of ambiguous on purpose so that people are allowed to speculate and there's really no wrong answers. But it also means that there's not really any right ones either. So
yeah, fair enough. Let's keep on moving. He also asks, do the Seraphon now have a functional space in AOS, or are they still on the outskirts of the setting? And then I'll tie that into your dad's Squigs question, which is, what do you think of the future of the Seraphon is, both model-wise and in the new universe? Do they fit well into the Age of Sigmar? Kind of a similar question. Where do you think the place for the Seraphon in AOS is? Does it still exist? Do they feel a need? Lay it on me. Anybody?
Yeah, I mean, I think I like, even though that they've kind of graded up a little bit, I like that they feel even more order than the Stormcast do, like almost more righteous, or more focused on the killing of chaos or the eliminating of chaos at a higher level even. So I think there's a place to out Stormcast the Stormcast a little bit.
I think model-wise in the future, I think we might see even more of this like technology. This, especially with the Thunder Lizards talking about how they're boosting their technology and understanding what's going on. You know, like I think we're going to probably see something that further pushes the envelope of the solar engine, or the gauntlet of the gods that's on the Old Blood's arm. Like we're going to see more of that push forward, I think.
Phil, you've been jonesing for these Seraphon for a while now. Does this new book cement the Seraphon with a place in AOS? And where do you think they're going to go from here?
I definitely think it gives them a solid place in the Age of Sigmar. I think something we didn't really talk a lot about, but the fact that we now know that like skinks are living in the cities of Sigmar as well, I think is a really important tie-in to give them a connection to the rest of Order. And so I feel like they certainly have a place. I think they will be working in parallel a lot, I think, with the rest of Order. Although, as we've mentioned, they're sort of like the purest form of like anti-chaos. I mean, I know that's Order, but like the Order factions don't all sort of pertain to the like that pure sense of what Order would be. So I think that they can sort of be that almost authoritarian level of Order, where it's like everything is going to have an exact purpose and function in place. And like I think it'll be interesting to try and play that out in the story, because that probably doesn't jive very well with a lot of like the free peoples in the Age of Sigmar. Like they probably don't appreciate their cities getting wiped off the face of the earth because they just happen to be on a ley line nexus, and they're like, sorry, we need this space, you're all dead. So I think there could be some tension there too. I think that's going to be interesting.
Yeah, I agree. If you would have asked me before reading this book, I would have thought that, or I would have maybe said that this was a Tomb King equivalent army, and it probably shouldn't have made it this far. But now that I've spent more time thinking about it, talking about it, and like reading the Battletome, I think they are uniquely positioned in that they are probably one of the most direct descendants from the world that was. And if we're going to continue to sort of have that thread that links us back to the old world, there's no reason why this army can't be that thread, like as sort of a reminder as to the connection between the mortal realms and the old world. And so because of that, I'm warming up to the idea of having them sort of continue on. I don't think they'll ever be the main characters. They'll never really be the stars. They're always going to be sort of supplemental. And that's pretty good. And I don't know when I expect the next time for them to get, new models or anything. It may be, forever before they end up actually getting anything new. And they'll always sort of serve as sort of like plot devices or, plot movers for the sake of some other, maybe more important army. But like, I'm okay with that. I mean, like, I don't play them, so it doesn't really bother me all that much. But there's a need for armies like that, and I think the Seraphon can fill that role. And it's nice that they already have quite a large range, even if some of it's a little outdated, that like you still have a lot of options and a lot of creativity, and the army itself sort of lends itself to getting creative with it. Plus dinosaurs are cool. So I think they'll be around for a while. Final question from ThunderCake, who wants to know, if you were to build a Dinotopia themed force, what color scheme would you use? I really liked the Dinotopia books as a, kid. But the dinosaurs were all different colors. I don't know how you would get a color scheme out of that. But do you guys have any thoughts? What color scheme would you use? I'll tell you what, even if you weren't doing a Dinotopia themed force, if you were doing any Seraphon force, what color scheme would you go about using?
Well, to address the Dinotopia themed, if I'm not mistaken, it's watercolor. So I would probably use some desaturated colors for your color scheme. So maybe something like contrast paints, or using glazes to glaze down those colors and use the desaturation to link the colors together, as opposed to necessarily the being straight, like red, green, white, or purple, yellow, green, right? I would probably use the desaturation to allow you to make some natural looking markings on the dinosaurs themselves. I think it would be really cool if you actually did a Free Cities army using the dinosaurs. I think that would be a really cool take. But as far as having a strong triple color triad, I think that would kind of miss the theme and the cool look of the Dinotopia. So I wouldn't probably stick with that, as opposed to normally when that would be a really strong idea to make a strong identity for the army.
Cool. Anybody else have any thoughts? I mean, that's a solid answer.
Phil, what's the theme of your force?
So I really, at least for the humanoid figures, I do actually really like just that very bright blue color. I just think it stands out really nicely. And I don't see a lot of reason to try and change that. But and I mean, maybe this is not super creative, but for thinking about the army, it's like, well, here are these bright blue lizards. They're just like, that's how they were made. That's the color that they are. But all the monsters and things that they use are creatures that live in these places naturally, and they all have their different colors. So I tried to think about it as like, well, what if we look at nature, what would these things look like? So like my Carnosaur is green. I was probably going to use blues or greens on the flying creatures, just because like in nature, like predators that fly have lighter colored bellies because it makes them look, they blend in more with the sky. So like I was going to go with a more realistic color scheme for a lot of the creatures, which I know is not always super interesting or entertaining, but it's something that I think feels very grounded and can give a sense of cohesion to a force, to be like, it's supposed to look like a lived, real, breathing thing.
Yeah, my Seraphon are also the same color, so I would definitely be on board with Phil's idea as well.
I've got two thoughts. One, I would love to see a starborn list or whatever paint scheme where they're very ethereal, trying to make that I don't know, somewhere between. And I think this came out like when the first book came out, thought this would be cool, where you paint them something ethereal, but then kind of like the Tau camo look, where they're turning solid, or they're turning more tangible, would be really cool. But that's a lot of being really good with lights on the inside and darks on the outside kind of thing. Otherwise, for my cog fort, I've thought about having a few like skinks as guides, or something where the skinks are kind of trailing them as they're marching and stomping through the forests in Garan. That there'd be some dinos. I think I'd probably go a little more like yellow browns with some an accent color of red or something like that.
There's your answers to your listener questions. You're welcome. Thanks, guys, for asking them, though. Very kind of you. Let's get to the end. Before we wrap the show up, I want to talk about maybe some Black Library books that folks might want to read if you want to find out more about Seraphon. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of Seraphon-focused stories. In fact, I don't know of any. They may exist, but I haven't read any of them. But for example, there are some short stories that do feature Seraphon as I'll say antagonists, though I'm always on their side, so they'll always be protagonists for me. But they do show up in Beneath the Black Thumb by David Geimer, where they fight off some Nurgle forces. They're in the Godless short story, where they end up fighting off some Slanesh forces. So you can tell there's a theme, anti-chaos here. That's another one that's by David Geimer. And then I believe they're in The Lord of the Cosmic Gate by Gav Thorpe, which I think they're fighting off Tzeentch. So we're covering some ground there with defiance of the chaos forces, and they're always trying to mess with their goals. So if you like seeing chaos square off against Seraphon, or Seraphon squaring off against chaos, give those short stories a spin. They're pretty good. I think I read them all, so they're A-okay. Unfortunately, like I said, there's not really a lot of Seraphon stories that would feature them in their leading role, whether that's because they may or may not make great point of view characters, or you just haven't really gotten around to it yet. But if anybody's able to pull it off, I'll be first in line to read those stories. Maybe I'll be second in line behind Phil. I don't know. All right, but if we think of anything, we'll let you know. Or listeners, if you have any stories that feature Seraphon that you want to talk about, please let us know. I'd be happy to read them. And finally, the way we wrap most of these shows off is let's do a final review from our hosts, and we can talk about what we thought about the book as a whole, and whether or not we liked it or recommend it. I know we touched on it a little bit, but let's wrap a bow around it. Let's start with Phil as the guest.
I, as a Seraphon player, really enjoyed this book. I felt like it put a lot of meat on the skeleton that we had originally. I was perfectly happy with all the directions that they took everything. I found a lot of the little stories and tableaus that they had for just sort of fleshing out like what the Seraphon have been doing in the mortal realms to be very entertaining. And yeah, I would definitely recommend it. I think Seraphon might be one of those armies that people don't have as good of an understanding of compared to some, just because of the nature of them not being, as prevalent in the stories elsewhere. So even if you, ingest a lot of the lore at the whole, you probably don't know a lot about Seraphon. So this one might be a good read just to fill out some of those fringe areas of the lore that aren't going to get mentioned a lot elsewhere outside of this book.
Yeah, I agree. That's true. Eric, what'd you think about it?
I'm going to give this book 300 out of 365 days in the Aztec calendar. And I think that's because I do think that there's a lot of some interesting things in here that, tie to the old world and bring this army in line with AOS in a way that, pleases both people that want to move forward and those who want to, have something of the old world still. Maybe more so than any other, army in Age of Sigmar. And I think maybe it's just they've become more dimensional, I think, with these new ideas. So I think that's really cool. But I think, Battletome's going to be really more focused to somebody who wants to play big dinos, So I think if you like big dinos, if you like complex thinking skinks and amphibians, this is really cool.
Right on. Paul, what'd you think?
I probably would give this 6 out of 8 spider legs. I did really enjoy the lore that was there. I appreciated the 4 constellations, but I think I'm missing a little bit of the, I don't know if it's regional differences. All the differences to me read a lot as it's in this realm, so it has this property, right? There was not as many. I missed the individual armies and more of like kind of a cool, I don't know, having any named skink heroes, having any named Saurus heroes. I missed that agency, and I wish that would have been a little bit more prevalent. But that being said, I'm not disappointed in the book. I just wish there was a little bit more to hook your own army into the narrative. Let's put it that way.
Okay, yeah, sure. From my perspective, I'll maybe just give it. I'll give it 3 out of 4 of the main constellations. I can't think of a better rating system. Seraphon were so very, very low on my list before reading this, so they've improved their standing. They're moving up in the world a little bit. I think this does a better job of fleshing them out as opposed to being Stardust. And if this is the direction they end up going, I support it, and I hope to know more. And as I say with almost all our Battletome reviews, I can't wait to see Seraphon leave their mark on the story at large. If they are going to be a full-fledged army that we're going to see a lot more of, I know sort of contrary to what maybe I predicted before, but like if you're gonna use them, and put them to work. Affecting the moral realms, even if they do it subtly. I mean, I don't need big flashy showy actions or efforts in the world, but like I want to know that they somehow are pulling some strings in some way to affect the direction that the moral realms go in, and I hope they do, because they obviously are capable of doing so. So let's put that immense power to work. So I'm optimistic for the future, and I do hope to see more. Because they're cool. They're giant dinosaur people. What's not to love? Any other thoughts, everybody? Leamame. Too bad you missed your chance. Eric, would you be so kind to close us out?
It's time for our reforging, but Sigmar willing will be back soon. Like, subscribe, share, or leave a review. Join us on Discord. Drop a tip on our Patreon. Anything you can do will spread the word of Sigmar farther than we can do it on our own. Chat with us anytime about your thoughts on Twitter @TheMortalRealms. Where can they find you, gentlemen?
I'm Aaron, and you can find me on Twitter @DosAsos.
I'm Phil, and I'm on What the Heck's podcast for you Underworlds players.
My name is Paul, and I am FBJ Shard.
And this is Eric. I'm @StoneMonkGamer on Twitter, and you can find all of our Mortal Realms content and shows at themortalrealms.com. Get ready to hear a whole lot of unintelligible unfathomable plans. God, why do you give me these words? Unfathomable. Oh my God.
Talking. Thunder lizards are beset by the null myriad. I'm just going to read the words of the Bone Reapers on a myriad. I used the word twice. Of realms' edges.